Hello and welcome to lecture number 55. This is topic 4.2, Anti-Colonialism and Black Political Thought. There's 3 learning objectives, and the first one is describe the Black freedom movement in the 20th century. The Black freedom movement refers to the movement in the United States from the mid-1940s to the 1970s, which was active in opposing Jim Crow laws and segregation in the United States. This movement also had a significant impact globally. So it includes the civil rights movement, which is generally characterized by 4 major organizations: the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. These organizations played crucial roles in advancing the movement's goals, and more details about them will be covered in topic 4.6. The Black freedom movement also encompassed the Black power movement, which heightened Black consciousness and racial pride both in the United States and abroad. Some of the main figures associated with this aspect of the movement include Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, which he was a prominent member of. Malcolm X's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, where he embraced a more inclusive perspective on race, marked a turning point in his activism. We will explore this topic more deeply in 4.9. The second learning objective is describe examples of diasporic solidarity that emerged across the African diaspora in the 20th century. This means that African American writers, leaders, and activists visited Africa during the 1950s and 1960s because they saw the struggle against colonialism as intertwined with their own fight against discrimination at home in the United States. They expressed strong support for decolonization, and this sentiment was partly influenced by the aftermath of World War II. After the war, most European colonizing countries were significantly weakened and less capable of sustaining their empires. For example, in 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered the Winds of Change speech in South Africa, signaling that European powers recognized the inevitability of decolonization in Africa. This speech is often looked at as a turning point for global anti-colonial movements. Some Black freedom movement leaders embraced Pan-Africanism, a belief in the shared identity and unity of all people of African descent. This ideology emphasized the potential for political and cultural solidarity among the African diaspora. Pan-Africanism as a concept dates back to the early 20th century, with figures like Marcus Garvey advocating for a return to Africa and African self-determination through his Universal Negro Improvement Association. One notable example of this ideology in practice was Paul Robeson, an American musician and actor who co-founded the Council on African Affairs, or the CAA. The CAA lobbied for support for Nigerian unions, Black striking miners in South Africa, famine relief, and even Indian independence. Robeson's efforts were part of a larger wave of global solidarity that connected civil rights struggles in the U.S. with anti-colonial movements worldwide. The CAA also published a monthly bulletin titled New Africa, which promoted these causes and kept its audiences informed about global issues related to colonialism and racial injustice. Similarly, Malcolm X became a prominent advocate for connecting African American struggles with global anti-colonial movements. In 1964, during a speech in Cairo, he declared, "We are living in an era of revolution, and the revolt of the American Negro is part of the rebellion against the oppression and colonialism which would characterize this era." These connections underscored the belief that anti-colonialism was a unifying issue for oppressed people worldwide, fostering a shared vision of liberation and solidarity. Ghana gained its independence in 1957, with Kwame Nkrumah becoming its first president after British rule. Nkrumah, born in Ghana, was influenced early in life by American-educated teachers who introduced him to the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Later, he studied in the United States, attending the historically Black Lincoln University, where he earned a degree and then completed a master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania. When Nkrumah returned to Ghana and was elected its first president, he established a socialist republic. However, his government eventually devolved into authoritarianism and one-party rule. Despite these challenges, Nkrumah framed Ghana's independence as part of a broader continental struggle for freedom. He famously declared, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent." Nkrumah's Pan-African vision was shaped by global influences, including his exposure to American civil rights leaders. Ghana's independence was one of the first on the African continent, inspiring visits from many American black liberation leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X both visited Ghana, with Malcolm X traveling there after his split from the Nation of Islam. These visits profoundly shaped Malcolm X's views on global Pan-Africanism. King attended Ghana's independence celebrations in 1957, viewing it as a beacon of hope and a model for nonviolent liberation. The writer and poet Maya Angelou also spent time in Ghana, living in the capital, Accra. She later reflected on her experiences in her memoir, All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, which explores the complexities of being African American living in Africa. In Ghana, Angelou found herself in a place where her skin color was not the primary source of her identity, though her American background brought unique challenges. Angelou's time in Ghana coincided with a cultural renaissance in the country as African and diaspora leaders sought to reclaim African heritage. Pauli Murray, who was a trailblazing civil rights lawyer, writer, and later a priest, also contributed to Ghana's developments by teaching at the Ghana School of Law. She later became the first African American to graduate from Yale Law School. She even contributed meaningful briefs to major Supreme Court cases on gender discrimination, mainly Reed versus Reed. Murray was a central figure in the fight for gender and racial equality in the U.S., coining the term Jane Crow to describe the double discrimination faced by black women. W.E.B. Du Bois, at the very end of his life, moved to Ghana in 1961 at the invitation of President Nkrumah. After the U.S. refused to renew his passport, Du Bois became a citizen of Ghana and worked on the Encyclopedia Africana, a project envisioned as a comprehensive work centering black history and culture. Unfortunately, he was unable to complete it due to funding and time constraints. Du Bois passed away in 1963. His funeral was attended by dignitaries from around the world, and it underscored his global significance as a scholar and activist. The Encyclopedia Africana project was later revived by scholars such as Henry Louis Gates Jr., who published it in 1999. This work aims to fulfill Du Bois's dream of a resource that would celebrate and document the achievement and history of the African diaspora. Another American contributing to building black diasporic solidarity was Joe Louis, the renowned heavyweight boxer known as the Brown Bomber. Louis held the heavyweight title for a record 12 years from 1937 to 1949, and he gained national fame for his legendary matches against German boxer Max Schmeling. Schmeling, supported by Hitler's Nazi regime, made their bouts more than just boxing matches. They became symbolic clashes between opposite ideologies. Louis's victory in the rematch in 1938 was celebrated not only as a personal triumph, but also as a blow against the Nazi racial superiority narrative. This match became a defining moment in sports history, uniting Americans across racial lines, albeit briefly during a time of deep segregation. After retiring from boxing, Louis continued his efforts to advocate for racial equality. In 1960, he traveled to Cuba as part of a predominantly African-American delegation shortly after Fidel Castro's success in the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Castro had overthrown the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista and established a communist government. The Cuban Revolution sought to address systemic inequalities, and Castro quickly outlawed racial discrimination, framing the revolution as part of a larger global anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle. Cuba became a focus of interest for African Americans, partly because of Castro's stance on racial equality. Joe Louis and the delegation discussed plans to promote Cuba as a potential travel destination for African Americans. This effort aimed to provide an alternative to the United States, where African Americans often face humiliation of segregation, Jim Crow laws, and restricted access to facilities while traveling. However, the initiative ultimately faltered due to Cuba's communist ties and the broader geopolitical tensions of the Cold War. The United States government, wary of Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union, discouraged any association with the country. This was emblematic of a larger trend during the Cold War, where American civil rights efforts were often complicated by international politics, as the U.S. sought to maintain its image as a leader of the free world despite its internal racial inequalities. While the Cuba Initiative did not succeed, it reflected a growing recognition of the interconnectedness of racial and anti-colonial struggles worldwide. And the final learning objective is explain how diasporic solidarity between African Americans and Africans impacted Black politics in the U.S. and abroad in the 20th century and beyond. The growth of a diasporic solidarity emerged as African Americans and Africans increasingly recognized that they shared a common struggle against anti-Black racism and oppression. This connection became particularly evident during Malcolm X's 1964 tour of West Africa, during which he spoke at the Organization of African Unity, OAU Summit in Cairo, representing the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or the OAAU. In his speech, Malcolm X emphasized the interconnectedness of the struggles faced by African-descended peoples. He stated, "African problems are our problems, and our problems are African problems. We also believe that as heads of independent African states, you are the shepherds of all African peoples everywhere, whether they are still at home here on the mother continent or have been scattered abroad." This part of Malcolm X's speech encapsulated his belief that all people of African descent shared a common fate and that unity was essentially to overcoming colonialism and anti-Black racism. This was a continuation of Pan-African ideals championed earlier by leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who had previously collaborated with Malcolm X to align African and African American liberation movements. Malcolm X's efforts expanded the global reach of the Black freedom movement, resonating with audiences far beyond the United States. Civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. became widely recognized figures across the world, influencing international audiences and inspiring solidarity with global struggles. For example, King's 1964 Nobel Peace Prize win not only elevated the civil rights movement, but also linked it to broader global movements for human rights and justice. This international solidarity had a profound influence on other liberation movements, such as the fight against apartheid in South Africa. The anti-apartheid struggle, led by figures like Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, or the ANC, found inspiration and support from the success of the American civil rights movement. The global recognition of African American leaders also highlighted the hypocrisy of racial discrimination in the U.S., forcing American policymakers to address civil rights issues as part of the Cold War's battle for hearts and minds. In addition, cultural exchanges played a role in fostering solidarity, such as when African leaders welcomed African American activists to their nations. These exchanges reinforced the notion that the fight against racial oppression was both local and global. This ever-growing unity among African-descended peoples helped amplify calls for justice, making the Black freedom movement a truly international struggle. Diasporic solidarity also brought significant attention to decolonization movements, raising awareness among Americans of the larger global efforts to shed colonial powers. One notable example is Richard Wright's attendance at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. This landmark gathering brought together Asian and African nations to discuss shared struggles and aspirations. These countries, many of them newly independent, initiated the non-alignment movement during the height of the Cold War, asserting their sovereignty in the face of the global struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Wright's reflections on the conference were later published in his book, The Color Curtain, which highlighted the connection between colonialism, racism, and global politics. The momentum for decolonization grew dramatically in 1960, often referred to as the Year of Africa. During this year, 17 African nations declared independence from European colonial rule. This wave of liberation included nations from the French West and Equatorial Africa, as well as former British colonies like Nigeria, Belgian holdings like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Italian territories such as Somalia. The speed of these independence movements reflected the weakening grip of European powers in the aftermath of World War II and the growing pressure from global anti-colonial movements. This period also saw heightened resistance for apartheid in South Africa. The Sharpeville Massacre of 1960, in which South African police killed 69 unarmed Black protesters, galvanized global opposition to apartheid. The massacre marked a turning point, leading to the banning of anti-apartheid organizations like the African National Congress, or ANC, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, forcing many activists into exile or underground resistance. Diasporic solidarity continues to influence movements in the present day. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, which began in the United States to protest the killings of unarmed Black men and women by police, has resonated with communities worldwide. In Paris, France, BLM has inspired large protests in response to similar incidents of police violence against Black people, reflecting the global relevance of the movement. One notable case was the 2016 death of Adama Traoré, a young Black man who died in police custody in France, sparking widespread protests and calls for justice. Another example of an organization fostering diasporic connections is Black Hive, with advocates for climate and environmental justice for Black communities around the globe. The movement highlights the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation and climate change on Black and other marginalized communities, particularly in areas of the African diaspora like the Caribbean and parts of Africa. By linking environmental justice to the broader struggle for racial equality, Black Hive exemplifies the ongoing relevance of global solidarity in addressing interconnected challenges. And finally, here's the recap. The Black freedom movement in the US in the mid-20th century included the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movements. Pan-Africanism and diasporic solidarity acknowledge the shared struggles against anti-Black racism and oppression. And finally, the diasporic solidarity grew between Black freedom leaders in African countries going through decolonization. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.